This dog messed with the wrong bull, and the unexpected happens. The dust hung thick in the air of the cattle yards at Willow Creek Station, coating everything in a fine red powder that turned to mud in the sweat running down Jake Morrison's face. He leaned against the weathered fence railing, watching his newest cattle dog, a black, muscular beast named Brutus, work the yards with the kind of aggressive confidence that made Jake's stomach clench with worry. The dog was barely 18 months old, all muscle and ego, with none of the wisdom that came from experience. Jake had bought Brutus from a breeder in Queensland who'd sworn the dog came from championship bloodlines, descended from the legendary working dogs that had built the cattle industry across northern Australia. And sure enough, Brutus had the build, the speed, the instinct. What he didn't have was respect. Not for Jake, not for the cattle, not for the dangers that came with working 1,500-kilo bulls that could kill a dog with one well-placed kick. "Brutus, back off!" Jake called out as the dog circled too close to a young Brahman bull's hooves. But Brutus ignored him, as he always did, darting in to nip at the bull's heels with teeth that were meant to control, not antagonize. The Brahman bellowed and kicked out, his hoof missing Brutus by centimeters. The dog seemed to think it was a game, his tail wagging as he danced away and came back for another go. Jake's jaw clenched. He'd seen too many good dogs killed by overconfidence, their bodies broken by animals that outweighed them by hundreds of kilos and had temperaments to match. Jake's father, who'd worked this station for 40 years before passing it down to Jake, had always said that a good cattle dog needed 3 things: courage, intelligence, and respect. Brutus had the first 2 in spades, but the third was sorely lacking, and in the yards that could be fatal. The station sat in the heart of the Northern Territory, 2 hours from the nearest town, surrounded by red earth and spinifex grass that stretched to the horizon in every direction. Jake had grown up here, learned to ride before he could properly walk, spent his childhood in these very yards, learning the rhythms of cattle work. He was 32 now, running the property alone since his father's death, and he couldn't afford to lose a working dog to stupidity. "Brutus!" Jake shouted again, his voice sharp with authority. "Heel!" But Brutus was already moving, charging at a group of cattle near the far gate. Most of them scattered as they should, trained to respect the dogs that worked them. But one didn't move. A massive Brahman bull that Jake Stockman had nicknamed Emperor, partly for his size and partly for the way he seemed to regard humans and dogs alike as subjects who'd forgotten their place. Emperor was the biggest bull Jake had ever raised, standing nearly 2 meters at the shoulder, with a distinctive pale cream coat that seemed to glow in the harsh Australian sun. His horns curved up and out in perfect symmetry, each one as thick as Jake's forearm at the base. The bull was 4 years old, in his prime, and worth more than Jake's ute, his breeding fees alone keeping the station profitable during the tough years when the drought made everything else a struggle. But Emperor had something else too, something Jake had noticed growing over the past year: a temper, an unwillingness to be pushed around by dogs or humans, an intelligence in his dark eyes that seemed almost calculating. Jake's stockmen were wary of him, giving him space, using gentle pressure rather than force to move him through the yards. Brutus had no such caution. The dog charged straight at Emperor, barking aggressively, trying to force the massive bull to move. But Emperor didn't move. He stood perfectly still, his huge head lowering slightly, his eyes fixed on the dog with an intensity that made the hair on the back of Jake's neck stand up. "Brutus, no, get back here." Jake vaulted over the fence, his boots hitting the dusty ground hard. He was running before he'd fully registered the decision, his heart pounding as he watched the standoff unfold. Brutus, emboldened by the bull's stillness, darted in closer. He snapped at Emperor's front legs, his teeth clicking together in the empty air. It was a classic cattle dog move, designed to make a stubborn animal move forward. But Emperor wasn't a normal animal. The bull moved with shocking speed for something so massive. His head swung sideways, and one of those curved horns caught Brutus in the ribs, lifting the 50-kilo dog off the ground and tossing him through the air like he weighed nothing. Brutus yelped, a sound of surprise more than pain, and landed hard in the dust 3 meters away. Jake's blood ran cold. He'd seen this before. Seen bulls gore dogs that got too cocky. Seen the aftermath of what those horns could do to flesh and bone. He sprinted towards Brutus, shouting, trying to distract Emperor, trying to get between the bull and the dog before the inevitable second attack that would finish what the first had started. But something stopped him. Emperor wasn't charging. The massive bull stood perfectly still, watching Brutus with those intelligent eyes, his sides heaving with breath that raised clouds of dust from his cream-colored hide. Brutus was on his feet again, shaking his head, clearly dazed but alive, uninjured except for what would probably be a spectacular bruise. And then the unexpected happened. Brutus, instead of retreating or attacking again, sat down. Right there in the dust, maybe 5 meters from Emperor, the dog simply sat, his tongue lolling, his dark eyes fixed on the bull with something that looked almost like respect. Emperor snorted, a sound that echoed across the yards and made the other cattle shift nervously. The bull pawed the ground once, sending up a spray of red dust, then turned and walked calmly towards the gate Jake had been trying to herd him through, as if the entire confrontation had been his idea all along. Jake stood frozen, his heart still racing, watching as his supposedly untrainable dog followed the bull at a respectful distance, no longer nipping or barking, just working quietly and efficiently to guide Emperor through the gate. It was the kind of behavior Jake had been trying to train into Brutus for months, the kind of calm, controlled work that made the difference between a good cattle dog and a great one. What the hell had just happened? Jake spent the rest of the afternoon watching Brutus work with a mixture of amazement and confusion. The dog that had been impossible to control just hours earlier was now moving cattle with precision and patience, maintaining proper distance, reading the animal's body language, responding to Jake's commands the first time they were given. It was like watching a completely different dog. But the most remarkable thing was how Brutus behaved around Emperor. Whenever the big bull was in the yards, Brutus worked differently, more carefully, more respectfully. He'd glance at Emperor before making a move, as if checking in, as if asking permission. And Emperor, for his part, seemed to tolerate the dog's presence in a way he never had before. That evening, Jake sat on his veranda with a beer, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of orange and purple as it sank towards the horizon. Brutus lay at his feet, exhausted from the day's work but content, his breathing steady and even. Jake reached down and scratched behind the dog's ears, feeling the solid muscle beneath the short black coat. "What happened out there today, boy?" Jake asked quietly. "What did that bull teach you?" Brutus's tail thumped twice against the wooden boards of the veranda, but the dog didn't lift his head. Jake took another sip of his beer and thought about what his father used to say. Sometimes the best teachers aren't human. Sometimes an animal learns more from another animal in 5 minutes than a human can teach them in 5 years. Over the following weeks, Jake noticed something even stranger developing. Brutus and Emperor had formed what could only be described as a partnership. When Jake needed to move Emperor from one paddock to another, a task that usually required 2 stockmen and careful planning, he found he could send Brutus alone. The dog would trot out to wherever Emperor was grazing, sit down at a respectful distance, and wait. Emperor would look up, acknowledge the dog with a slight movement of his massive head, and then simply follow Brutus back to the yards. No nipping, no barking, no aggression, just mutual respect and understanding. Jake's stockmen thought he was mad when he first told them about it. Davo, his head stockman who'd been working cattle for 30 years, actually laughed. "Boss, you've been out in the sun too long," Davo said, pushing his battered hat back on his head. A dog and a bull working together. That's not how nature works. Come see for yourself, Jake had replied, leading him out to the holding paddock. They stood at the fence and watched as Brutus approached Emperor, who was grazing near a stand of ghost gums. The dog sat, the bull looked up, and then, as if they'd rehearsed it, Emperor began walking towards the yards with Brutus following alongside. Not behind, not herding, but alongside, like equals. Davo's jaw went slack. Well, I'll be damned. Never seen anything like it in my life. Neither had Jake, but he wasn't about to question something that worked. The station ran smoother with Brutus and Emperor's strange partnership. Other cattle seemed to pick up on it too, following Emperor's lead when he moved calmly with the dog, rather than scattering in panic as they sometimes did when worked too aggressively. But the real test came during the muster, when Jake needed to bring in 300 head of cattle from the far paddocks for weighing and sorting. It was hot, brutal work, the kind that tested both men and animals to their limits. The temperature had been pushing 40 degrees for weeks, and the cattle were cranky, spread out across thousands of acres looking for whatever green feed they could find. Jake sent his stockmen out on motorbikes and horses, working the edges of the mob, but the center was chaos. Younger bulls were fighting, cows were protecting calves, and the whole mob was threatening to break and scatter. Jake could feel the day spiraling out of control, could see the exhaustion on his men's faces, could hear the frustration in their voices over the radio. Then he had an idea. It was crazy, probably stupid, but desperate times called for desperate measures. He called Davo over the radio. "Bring Emperor up to the front of the mob," Jake said. "Say again, boss." Davo's voice crackled with static and disbelief. "You heard me. Get Emperor up front and bring Brutus with him." There was a long pause. Then, "This better work, Jake, or we're going to lose half this mob." Jake watched through his binoculars as Davo and 2 other stockmen carefully moved Emperor from the back of the mob to the front. The big bull didn't resist, especially with Brutus trotting alongside, that strange communication passing between dog and bull that Jake still didn't fully understand. And then something remarkable happened. Emperor, standing at the front of the mob with Brutus beside him, simply started walking towards the yards. Not running, not fighting, just walking with steady, purposeful strides. And the rest of the mob, seeing their leader move, began to follow. It was the smoothest muster Jake had run in his entire life. 300 head of cattle, moving as one, following a bull and a dog, who'd somehow figured out how to work together in a way that defied everything Jake had been taught about animal behavior. His stockmen were whooping and hollering, disbelief and joy mixed in equal measure. That night, after the cattle were yarded and the men had gone home, Jake sat on the fence and watched Brutus and Emperor in the holding pen. They were on opposite sides of the yard, but there was an awareness between them, a connection Jake couldn't explain. Brutus would look up every few minutes, checking on the bull. Emperor would pause in his grazing, his ears swiveling towards the dog. "You two are something special," Jake said aloud, even though he knew they couldn't understand him. "Don't know how you figured each other out, but I'm grateful you did." Brutus's tail wagged, and Jake could have sworn Emperor's ears twitched in response. The dog that had messed with the wrong bull had found something unexpected, not an enemy, but a partner, and in doing so had become the kind of working dog Jake's father would have been proud of. Word spread fast in the territory. Station owners talked over beers at the pub in Catherine, stockmen swapped stories at cattle sales, and soon Jake was fielding phone calls from people who wanted to see the dog and bull who worked together. Some were curious, others were skeptical. A few wanted to buy Emperor for breeding, offering prices that made Jake's head spin. But Jake wasn't interested in selling. Emperor and Brutus had become more than just working animals. They'd become a symbol of something Jake couldn't quite put into words. Something about respect and understanding, about how the most unlikely partnerships could form when ego stepped aside and genuine connection took its place. The real challenge came during the wet season. The rains arrived with typical territory intensity, turning the red dust to thick mud and the dry creek beds into raging torrents. Jake lost 3 days checking fences and clearing debris, working dawn to dusk in rain that came down like bullets. On the 4th day, when the rain finally eased to a drizzle, one of his neighbors called with news that made Jake's blood run cold. "Jake, it's Tom from Riverside Station. We've got a situation. Flash flood came through last night and took out your eastern fence line. About 50 head of your cattle came through onto my property, including that big cream bull of yours. They're mixed in with my mob now, and I need to sort them out before the next buyer comes through." Jake thanked Tom and hung up, his mind already calculating. Riverside was 40 kilometers away across rough terrain. The roads would be borderline impassable after the rain, and sorting 50 head out of Tom's 2,000-strong mob would take days, maybe weeks, especially without Emperor to keep them calm. Davo appeared in the doorway of the office, his clothes still soaked from the morning's work. Heard the call. "What's the plan, boss?" Jake looked out the window at Brutus, who was lying on the veranda, watching the rain with those intelligent dark eyes. An idea was forming, crazy and impossible, but then again, everything about Brutus and Emperor's relationship had seemed crazy and impossible at first. "We're taking Brutus to Riverside," Jake said. "If he can bring Emperor back, the rest will follow." Davo's eyebrows shot up. "That's 40 k's of rough country, Jake. And the dog would have to find one bull in thousands of acres. Even if he could track Emperor's scent, the rain would have washed most of it away." "I know," Jake said. "But I've watched these two for months now. There's something between them that goes beyond training or instinct. If any dog can find that bull, it's Brutus." The drive to Riverside took 3 hours, the ute sliding through mud and fording swollen creeks that had Jake's heart in his throat. Brutus sat in the back, calm and alert, as if he understood the importance of the mission. When they finally reached Tom's property, the older cattleman met them at the gate, his weathered face skeptical. "You brought a dog to find a bull in all this?" Tom gestured at the vast expanse of waterlogged paddocks stretching to the horizon. "Jake, I respect you, but that's madness." "Just give us a chance," Jake said. "Worst case, we waste a few hours and then do it the traditional way." Tom shrugged and opened the gate. Jake let Brutus out of the ute, and the dog immediately began working, his nose to the ground, circling and casting about. Jake had brought one of Emperor's old feed buckets, hoping the scent would help, but Brutus barely sniffed it. Instead, the dog stood perfectly still for a long moment, his head raised, his body tense. Then, without warning, he took off running. Jake and Davo jumped back in the ute and followed, bouncing over rough ground, trying to keep the black shape of Brutus in sight as he ran with purpose through the mud and rain. The dog never hesitated, never doubled back, just ran in a straight line across Tom's property like he knew exactly where he was going. They found Emperor, 20 minutes later, standing under a stand of kuliba trees with a mob of Tom's Brahman cattle. The big bull's cream coat was mud-splattered, and his sides were heaving, but he was unharmed. Brutus sat down about 10 meters away, just as he had that first day in the yards, and waited. Jake watched, hardly daring to breathe, as Emperor lifted his massive head and looked at the dog. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then Emperor snorted, pawed the ground once, and began walking towards Brutus, not running, not charging, just walking with that steady, purposeful gait Jake had come to recognize. "Well, I'll be damned," Tom muttered from beside Jake. "That's the damnedest thing I've ever seen. The journey back to Willow Creek took 6 hours. Emperor walked the entire way, following Brutus through mud and water, across creeks and through scrub. Behind him came the other 49 cattle that had crossed onto Tom's property, following their leader as they always did. Jake and his stockmen rode alongside on motorbikes, but they barely needed to do anything. Brutus and Emperor had it handled, By the time they reached the yards at Willow Creek, the sun was setting, painting the wet earth in shades of gold and crimson. Jake's entire body ached from the long day, but he couldn't stop grinning. He'd just witnessed something extraordinary, something that would go down in territory legend. A dog and a bull, working together across 40 kilometers of rough country, bringing home 50 head of cattle without a single animal lost. That night, Jake made a decision. He called a local journalist who'd been pestering him for months about doing a story on Emperor and Brutus. The story ran in the NT News, then got picked up by the national papers, then went viral on social media. Suddenly, Willow Creek Station was famous, and Jake was fielding interview requests from around the world. But more importantly, the story inspired others. Jake started getting calls from cattlemen who'd written off difficult dogs or dangerous bulls, asking for advice, wanting to know how to build that kind of trust and respect. Jake always told them the same thing. You can't force it. You can only create the conditions and then step back and let the animals figure it out themselves. A research team from the University of Queensland came out to study Emperor and Brutus, trying to understand the neurological and behavioral mechanisms behind their partnership. They set up cameras, ran tests, analyzed hundreds of hours of footage. In the end, their conclusion was simple. Mutual respect and clear communication can transcend species boundaries in ways science is only beginning to understand. 3 years passed. Emperor grew even more massive, his reputation as a breeding bull spreading across Australia and beyond. Buyers came from as far as the United States and Brazil to purchase his semen, and the fees alone kept Willow Creek Station profitable even during the worst droughts. Brutus, now nearly 5 years old, had sired several litters of puppies that cattlemen across the territory paid premium prices for, hoping to replicate even a fraction of his intelligence and work ethic. But the real legacy of their partnership was something money couldn't measure. Jake had started a program teaching young stockmen about animal behavior and respect-based handling. He brought them to Willow Creek, showed them Brutus and Emperor working together, and explained that the best way to control an animal wasn't through force or dominance, but through understanding and partnership. One autumn morning, Jake noticed Emperor moving differently. The big bull was slower, favoring his left front leg, and there was something in his eyes that Jake recognized from years of working with animals: pain. He called the vet immediately, a woman named Sarah who specialized in large animals and had been treating the station's cattle for years. Sarah's examination was thorough, but her face grew grave as she worked. When she finally stood up and wiped her hands on her jeans, Jake knew the news wasn't good. "It's his joints," she said quietly. "Arthritis, pretty advanced for his age. Probably genetic, maybe exacerbated by his size. He's carrying so much weight on that frame, Jake. His body's breaking down under the load." "Can we treat it?" Jake asked, though he already knew the answer. "We can manage the pain for a while, make him more comfortable." "But Jake, he's only 7. Most bulls this size don't make it past 8 or 9 with arthritis this severe, and the quality of life—" She trailed off, her meaning clear. Jake felt something crack in his chest. Emperor wasn't just a bull anymore. He was part of the station's soul, part of Jake's own story. And Brutus. How would Brutus handle losing his partner? Over the following months, Jake watched Emperor decline despite the pain medication and specialized care. The bull moved less, grazed less, spent more time lying down, but Brutus never left his side. The dog would curl up next to Emperor in the shade, would bring him fresh water in his bowl, would gentle nudge the bull to his feet when it was time to move to better grass. Jake had never seen anything like it. Brutus, who should have been out working cattle, chose instead to stay with Emperor, as if the dog understood that his friend needed him now more than the station did. Jake's other dogs handled the work, but everyone on the station felt the absence of the legendary pair. One evening, Jake found them together under the big coolibah tree near the homestead. Emperor was lying down, his breathing labored, his massive sides heaving. Brutus was pressed against the bull's shoulder, his head resting on Emperor's neck. They weren't moving, just existing together in the golden light of the setting sun. Jake sat down nearby, not wanting to disturb them, but unable to stay away. He thought about that first day in the yards, when Brutus had been all ego and aggression, when Emperor had taught the young dog a lesson about respect with one swift movement. He thought about the partnership that had grown from that moment, about how two animals who should have been natural enemies had instead become the best of friends. Sarah came that night, at Jake's request. She examined Emperor one final time, then sat down next to Jake on the veranda steps. Her eyes were red, and Jake realized she'd been crying. "He's suffering, Jake," she said softly. "More than the medication can control now. His organs are starting to fail under the strain. If this were my animal, I'd say it's time to let him go with dignity rather than wait for the end to come slowly." Jake nodded, unable to speak around the lump in his throat. He'd known this was coming, had been preparing himself for weeks, but knowing didn't make it easier. "Tomorrow morning," he finally managed. Let him have one more night, one more sunrise. That night, Jake didn't sleep. He sat under the coolibah tree with Brutus and Emperor, watching the stars wheel overhead, listening to the night sounds of the bush. Brutus didn't sleep either. The dog stayed pressed against Emperor's side, occasionally licking the bull's face, whining softly. When dawn broke, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Jake called Davo and Sarah. They came quietly, respectfully, understanding the gravity of the moment. Sarah prepared her equipment while Jake knelt beside Emperor, running his hand along the bull's massive neck, feeling the warmth of him, the solid reality that would soon be gone. "You were the best, mate," Jake whispered. "Changed everything for this station. Changed me. Thank you for that. Thank you for teaching Brutus. Thank you for teaching all of us." Emperor's eyes found Jake's, and in them Jake saw understanding. Peace, even. The bull was ready. He'd lived a good life, had done what bulls were meant to do, and had formed a friendship that would be remembered long after he was gone. Brutus seemed to understand, too. As Sarah administered the injection, the dog pressed even closer to Emperor, his body trembling. The bull's breathing slowed, steadied, then stopped. The massive body went still, and the light faded from those intelligent eyes. Brutus let out a sound Jake had never heard from him before. Not a bark, not a whine, but something deeper, more primal, a keening that seemed to come from the dog's very soul. He pressed his face against Emperor's neck and stayed there, refusing to move even as the hours passed and Emperor's body grew cold. Jake buried Emperor under the coolibah tree, the place where he and Brutus had spent so much time together. The entire station crew came, and even some neighboring cattlemen who'd heard the news. They stood in silence as Jake said a few words. Then each person placed a stone on the grave, building a cairn that would mark the spot for years to come. Brutus lay on the grave for 3 days, refusing food, barely drinking water. Jake stayed with him, worried the dog would die of grief. But on the 4th morning, Brutus stood up. He sniffed the grave one final time, then walked slowly back to the homestead. The dog was different after that, quieter, more thoughtful, but no less effective at his work. He trained the younger dogs with patience Jake had never seen in him before, teaching them the lessons Emperor had taught him: respect, control, partnership over dominance. Years later, when Brutus was old and grey, Jake would bring him to Emperor's grave, and they'd sit together under the coolibah tree. The dog would rest his head on the stones of the cairn, and Jake could have sworn he saw peace in Brutus's eyes. The kind of peace that came from having known true friendship, from having been changed by it, from carrying those lessons forward even after the teacher was gone. This dog had messed with the wrong bull, and the unexpected had happened. Not violence, not death, but transformation. Two souls had found each other across the divide of species and had proven that respect, understanding, and love could create bonds stronger than anyone imagined possible. And that legacy lived on, not just in the puppies Brutus had sired or the calves Emperor had fathered, but in the way Jake and his stockmen approached their work, their animals, and each other. Some lessons, Jake realized, were worth more than any amount of money, and some friendships transcended everything, even death itself.